The Qualia Experience is a Spotify podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Quality Experience podcast. I am your host, Stanley Ikuge. Okay, first I want to apologize for the hiatus over the summer. I am currently back in school, working on my doctorate program, and I had a few intense research papers during the summer break. I also had family visit from Nigeria and the UK, so I had to extend my break. It was fun. Now I am back, and I promise to be more consistent in bringing you more interviews and other programs we plan on incorporating into the podcast. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's get to the interview. Our guest is Justin McSweeney. He has spent years as a hobbyist on these topics, exploring the deep questions surrounding existence, reality, and the societal structures that influence our behavior. For example, the nature of consciousness, political ethics, and the intersection of metaphysical thought and social systems. In a nutshell, during our discussion together, we explored the realms of philosophy, metaphysics, and social engineering. Three topics that challenge how we understand and shape the world today. So without further ado, I bring you Justin McSweeney.
Our guest today is Justin McSweeney. Hope I got that right.
Very good. Thank you.
McSweeney. He's a student of philosophy. Great knowledge in metaphysical and social engineering issues. I'd like you to come in now and introduce yourself more, and so we can get into some of the topics we have today.
And first of all, thank you so much for opening up the space for the two of us to have a conversation. I really appreciate that opportunity for us to dialogue. And also to the listening audience out there, thank you all so much for your attention. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for being here. So we'll go ahead and dive right into it. Let's start with the philosophy of the mind. I know we did pre-meet, we had a little discussion on this, and I wanted to save it so we could have it today during the show. And you did touch on several subjects: consciousness, the mind. We will all think we talked a little bit about complexities, ethics, and political philosophy and other stuff. But let's start with that, and then let's see what's your take on how I use the term awareness, because I really don't see how to define us. It's just an experience that's streaming on, and we see people, we experience ourselves, and there's this grand illusion of having a me, having a self. And see how you can break that down a little bit more.
Okay. We could start by laying some cards on the table that the philosophers usually talk about when it comes to consciousness. And when they start talking about that, there's at the ground floor, there's phenomenal consciousness. It is a kind of subjectivity, which is arguable. There are people who argue about that core constituency of subjectivity, etc. And then there's also something called access consciousness, which is a kind of, and this could be argued too, that's a kind of meta consciousness. It's being aware of being conscious. It's being aware of your environment. It's sort of a meta consciousness, aware that you're aware of what's going on. So it's that reporting consciousness versus, again, a phenomenal consciousness that is sort of a ground floor, that I am capable of being conscious. I have the sense organs or the sense apparatus to intake information, to actually create that awareness. So there's those two levels of consciousness. And when people debate consciousness, there are people who the big thing is overcoming what they call the hard problem of consciousness. It is, how does consciousness emerge from matter, from brain material, or anywhere in a living system, specifically the brain in most arguments. Some people will be dualists or substance dualists and say, consciousness is a byproduct or an epiphenomena of mental activity of neurons firing and things like that. Others will kind of argue that in like an idealist frame, that everything is consciousness, everything is mindedness, and they try to do arguments from that position. And then there's the panpsychists who there's varying degrees of panpsychism. Some of them stick to the sort of materialist aspect of consciousness, and they'll spray paint on a datum of discrete materiality, they'll spray paint a little bit of consciousness on a gluon or a quark or something, and then that emerges up, and that can lead to problems like combination problems and things. Like idealists have to deal with the idea how consciousness can seem to be an individual experience if it's all one mind or that kind of thing. And so there's a lot of areas, and there are people working on more novel ways of understanding it. The more materialist people will look at things like functionalism or parallelism. I was reading a book today called "It's on Animal Consciousness," and there's something he was kind of tongue-in-cheek saying revisionism, and it's basically just trying to narrow the gap that people like Chalmers, who is a philosopher of mind, was talking about, again, the hard problem of consciousness. How do we derive qualitative experience from material objects? So I'll put cards on the table, and we'll talk about what the Bodhisattva, the Buddha, talked about, and that there is, no self.
No self.
We can't take that literally, because it kind of falls into a paradoxical claim, because you and I are having a conversation right now, and we're dependent on each other for acknowledging the exchange of information and the ideas that are emerging. And so we are sort of in a relationship in that sense. And I'd say that to cut to a particular way of answering this, that everything is relations when it comes to a selfness or an identity of a me-ness. And but I'll open that up in a second, but I'll go back to the Buddha for a second, where he claimed that there is a no self. But I think that sense of no self arises from when he, had his meditative practice and got into this kind of state of, if you want to call it, enlightenment, where there's a realization that when you step away from the egoic aspect of selfness, the things that we use to identify ourselves with, that I think when the Buddha had his awakening, that he realized that, as you were saying, there really may not be an author there. There may not be. So there's no locus of attention. There was no, and I would challenge the listeners to find the locus of your selfness right now. And you can't. We typically intuit that it's in our head, because all of our sense organs are in our head. Those of us that are gifted with sight can say that, oh, behind my eyes, but that leads to the homuncular argument. There is no theater. There is no observer inside of the brain, that the brain is just it's a CPU essentially. That's very crude, and that could be debatable for sure, but it's processing information. And certainly the eyes are providing sense data, and the ears and the tastes and smells and the touch are all providing sense data. But again, we could, if you want to, really get into some heavy meditative thinking, is where is the locus of the self? Where is the self located? And I think that's part of what the Buddha might have been pointing to, is that when we break it down and we get out of our performative, prolific self, that we really, there is no locus of the self. And also in non-dual experience, and when someone is meditating or maybe using hallucinogens, that they dissolve the ego, and they really do, sort of assume this non-self, but still aware kind of status. And I used to meditate, and I can get into places where I'm kind of not being as much of me. So I can only imagine that, when you get into that non-dual state, that it's pretty profound. So it's arguable. And I think it's also paradoxical, because we ourselves, especially like you said, when we're interacting with our environment and other people, we have to be a self. But if we go to some cave and meditate for a year, and be a sadhu or something, and we renounce all of our sensate proclivities or whatever, that we can get into that state where the self tends to dissolve. And again, you can do that really fast with a drop of LSD or whatever it is that breaks that sense of ego. It scatters it. So I'll stop there.
And thank you for shedding light on that. So we'll go to the mind. Let's see what you think about the mind. I heard some Harris, his quote the other day, and he said something about we don't create our own thoughts. Thoughts are conceptual. Let's say, for example, when it comes to new ideas and new inventions, you can't think before you think. How can you explain that?
I would partially agree with Sam Harris on that the majority of what we think and do is wrought of artifacts of the past, and it is what we have onboarded since infancy. It is the library or compendium of information that we've gathered, both in the meme sense, but also in the semiotic sense, and any sense of giving us a sense that gives us a capacity to recall anything. So it could be feelings, it could be emotions, but again, it could also be signs, symbols, letters, language, events. And again, those are emotional. That's a recollection because it has to be based on something. And I think I agree with Harris that it's not arising out of thin air. I think there is some template inside the mind. Again, from the library of experience that we've had, or through vicarious experience when we're watching television. We watch a lot of romantic movies and soap operas or whatever that feeds, that primes our mind for it. It'd be a priori because we've not experienced it ourselves, but it would prime us to recognize something and say, oh, that's so. In other words, if I watch a lot of TV shows on Japan, which I do or I have, but I've never been to Japan, but I would absolutely love to go and spend about 6 weeks over there, just food and all of it. Yeah. So I'm kind of moving away from the question, but I think, I partially, but to also counter what Harris is saying, that again, in the imaginal, in the a priori, like my not having been to Japan, some of that has to be abstracted. I think some of that has to be imaginal. I think we have to use conceptual thinking, but also move away into what can be imagined for a potential future, if that makes any sense. So I think we should grant ourselves a little bit of license to open up that idea that if everything's based on templates and prior experience, or a prior experience that was not really experienced, but just onboarded as information. Again,
that's what I was getting to, because I know you based a few of explanations on experience. What if you've never had that experience?
Right.
There's nothing to compare it to, or there's nothing to recall. And also, even if you do recall, you don't have control of any of the actions you're taking. It's like, here are a couple of examples of ideas coming in. When you do have a new idea, it's just conceptual. There was no thought before the thought. There's no creation to it. That was where I kind of agree with him, but I do understand when you say recalling from experience, which we do, but that is based on the experience you already had in the past.
It sounds like, and I know Harris is a incompatibilist, and so what I might be getting out of this, and I'll have to ask you to clarify, is that he's saying that we are not in control. We have no executive control over the thoughts that come up, the awareness. So in other words, when the woman walks into the scene, that there is already going to be a flow of thoughts that come up regardless of whether I gatekeep them or not. Is that what you're
with the woman walking in and saying that would be based on experience, because you've seen that happen before.
Okay.
Either in a movie or in real life. Yeah, so that explains itself. But when it comes to new ideas, new creations, inventions, those had never existed. So you don't have a base, you don't have an experience to draw from. He was saying that most unique, new, nascent thoughts are conceptual. We don't know where they come from. That was really fascinating.
I would think that there's an argument there that, so in other words, again, it comes down to the provenance or the genesis of the thought is unique to me. It has to be unique to me. It's coming from, and so we have to delve into cognitive science for a moment here. And I think he was a neuroscience PhD. So he's framing it from a particular position, I guess. And I don't know his work well enough to know where he's coming from. But again, from what I understand of different takes on third generation cognosci, is that when a thought is, it sounds like it's, when he says it's conceptual, again, I want to know what he means specifically by conceptual, but what I'll turn around and just say, like from a cognosci, from the people that I listen to that talk about this, that when the brain is doing its thing, that there's a hierarchical set of, it's not consent, it's consensus. That's the word I was looking for. There's layers of consensus to form an idea based on sense data and sense input. So when we're thinking abstractly through the imaginal, it can't be too far away from that process, because we have that sort of it's either called predictive processing or active inference, are two schools that like to think about how we hierarchically arrange our sense making of information that is either given to us, or again, I don't know how to speak to imaginal thinking, which is, I think, is what he's saying in a conceptual sense, that we are conceiving, which if we look at the, what does conceive mean, or what is a concept, it's what are we perceiving in it, or what are we conceiving in that? So I'd have to understand a little bit more about where he's coming from with that. So I can't really answer his thing, but like I said, the Coxide people are, they would kind of lean into an order of processes that bring an idea to the fore. And sometimes when we have like an insight, when we have what we consider to be a novel idea, it is because we've kind of broken out from a normal pattern of thinking to try to conceive of an idea. And if that makes any sense. So in other words, that novelty can arise from a kind of either a frame break or a disruption of the thinking about the idea. So that it allows us that space to disrupt. So in other words, if I have a problem and I'm trying to solve it and I'm looking at it in just one particular way, and then somebody, distracts me and says something, but that something that they say then sparks this cascade of other thinking, that may be the frame break that's necessary for me. And it's not that they gave me the information, but then I come back to the problem. I've been distracted and I go back into it. It's not that simple, but that's a crude way of putting it. So I'll stop there because I may not have gone anywhere near where you want.
No, that's okay. Let's see if we could. What is your take on free will?
A lot of
Do
ways.
we have free will or we don't?
Well, see, I wouldn't put it on a binary like that. I wouldn't do the binary, but of course it makes for great debates, and there are been countless debates about it. And so again, to unpack these things, like Sam Harris is an incompatibilist. He's a hard determinist, and there's no compatibility with the psychic process. And I don't mean card readers. I'm talking about the mental process and causal determinism, which is a chain of events that have occurred since either the Big Bounce or the Big Bang, however you want to imagine the universe having been created, that the incompatibilists will say that everything is causally linked, everything is causally determined. And Robert Sapolsky just wrote a book on this, and he's a very hard incompatibilist. And I've seen him argue with some people on it. It's very interesting. But then there are other people like Dan Dennett, who just passed recently, who was a compatibilist. He was able to say, okay, yeah, we live in a causally determined system, but at the same time, due to our psychic complexity, and again, I use the word psychic in the sense of mental states of thought, our psychology, psychical status, that we, and I'm not doing Dennett justice by saying this, but he would basically say that there is a complexity there that kind of overrides that chain of physical events. And because of the mind process, computational process, whatever you want to call it, functional, and maybe his theories, a parallelist or a functionalist, would say that because we are so complex in our mentation and in our sapience, or whatever you want to call it, that it is not fully in lockstep with those causal events. There's the idea of Laplace's demon as a kind of weak argument against against compatibilism or libertarian free will, or people who advocate that would use the Laplace's demon argument to say that, well, if everything's causally determined, then we can predict the future. We can predict what will happen. It would take an incredible amount of computational power, but we could conceivably, if everything is sort of determined by a chain of events, and there are arguments against that, but that's an interesting argument to say. Laplace's demon was a demon who knew every point in the universe and a lot of what can happen next in these every quanta of data or materiality moving forward in a causal way. And that's not even a good way to describe Laplace's demon, but it's just basically, it's an all-knowing kind of demon that can predict future states. So to get to your answer, I would fall into the camp again where I don't think it's an argument. I think, and we talked about this when you and I were just chatting the other day, that psychological conditions, psychiatric conditions, mental pathologies, even subtle subclinical predilections of the mind are behavioral characteristics. There's the Ocean scale, which some people might roll their eyes at, or the different personality trait scales. Are we on the pathology or excuse me, the like psychopathy spectrum, where are we somewhere in there? Are we sociopaths? Are we narcissists? A lot of that determines our ability to navigate our actions. So I would say beyond the physical, the determinist argument, I would go more into the idea of psychology, which again is fraught with all kinds of problems. But we have behaviors, we have psycho-emotional states that more or less, sway our behavior. And I would say that, if we want to talk about having absolute free will, that we don't. And I could argue that from even an absurd perspective, that I couldn't turn into another kind of animal if I wanted to, and I would want to will that. I want to be that creature. I'd want to be another person, but I can't will that. So maybe that's one silly way or an absurd way of putting a cap on the will thing. But to go back down to reality a little bit more, I'd say we definitely make choices. But we also have to be aware that, again, whatever our condition is in a psychological or psychiatric sense is going to have a great sway on that. And I think more than just the causal chain of events since time began or since the universe began, I think that's getting a little too far into the weeds as far as, what drives our behavior. But I think our psychology drives our behavior far and away more than chains of events historically. And I would probably fall slightly away from the incompatibilists. I'd fall more into like Dan Dennett with the compatibilists. I wouldn't go with libertarian free will either, because I think, there are physiological processes going on top of the psychological processes that can, maybe point to the fact that we are not 100% in our sovereignty or agency, and that we are not governed entirely by our choices that we think we make. So, and there's other arguments, but I'll stop there because I don't want to bore people. But I think I would wiggle out of different ways. But I think my thing would be to point out psychology is that, whatever we're made up of mentally can really guide us in terms of how we behave. So in other words, like self-awareness. If people are not self-aware, if they behave abhorrently and they're not aware of that, are they in control? And then you're placing values on things and judgment values about their behavior. So that's a whole other thing.
So I would say to summarize it, you think on some level we do have the ability to make choices, and that's a form of free will. But on the grand scheme of things, we don't. But when it comes to a lower level of self, we do. Because we have the ability to make those choices.
I would say that it's very important because, if you listen to people like Sapolsky or Harris, who want to tell us we have absolutely no free will, they really don't have a big narrative behind how we are to have values and a sense of belonging and all that. I mean, they could say things, but when you talk about, like, if you tell somebody that they have no free will, I think the average person, I'm not talking about academics, because Sapolsky and Harris are academics. They both have PhDs. Sapolsky is an amazing lecturer. Other than his stance on incompatibilism, I deeply respect his work. He's a primatologist, biologist, and he's a kind of polymath. But I would tend to frown on the fact that he's selling a book that tells people they don't have free will. I don't think that's going to do wonders for a planet, a species of people who are already in crisis. We're already in various crises, and that is just gasoline on the fire as far as I'm concerned. Because a lot of people can intellectually handle it, but some people can't, and that just because they could go to nihilism.
The population are religious too, so you're taking away something that's really close to that.
This is true.
Yeah,
and both Harris and Sapolsky are ardent atheists, and that's fine. I don't certainly begrudge that. And again, I want to say, in Sapolsky's defense, this book should have no impact on how you lens your life. I mean, it should just be intellectual fodder, and you can take it or leave it. But I worry about the trickle down and people starting to parrot that information outside of Sapolsky's control and saying, you don't have any free will. It's just all determined. And, and some people make ludicrous remarks and they're like, well, how do we handle crime? How do we handle bad behavior? If a person, goes in and kills 3 or 4 people in a store or whatever, well, it was all determined. It was all, part of the causal chain. And I don't like that argument either. I don't think that's a good counterpoint. But yeah, it opens up a lot of ethical or questions about how we comport ourselves as people.
Do you know by any chance where Richard Dawkins stands on this?
With free will, I don't. I've never heard him discuss it. I'm sure he has, but I'm not aware of what he's had to say about it. I know Dennett and Harris were big with that.
Yeah, I know Harris is really big on it. Yeah, that's a good way to wrap that up. What about qualia? What do you think about it? I do know it means it tends to mean how you perceive a taste or color, not really the red itself, but how red feels. Would you go into it a little bit more, explain more?
When the philosophers argue about it, you'll have two camps basically, and some space in between maybe, and to bring Dennett up again, and again he just passed. So to those who found him to be an inspiring person, I share the sympathy of the loss of his mind. And the idea of qualia, as you said, is the qualities of experience. It is the redness of red. It is the smell of the rose. It is the feel, the touch, the taste, all these different things. So the argument goes that there are people who argue for the ontological and metaphysical status of qualia, and there are other people who say no, there's no grounding in that. So those are the illusionists. As Dan Dennett was what they would call an eliminativist. He did away with a lot of the qualitative experience in consciousness. Keith Frankish is an illusionist, and he says that it's not necessarily an illusion, and he's very careful about that. A lot of people rip him to shreds for it, and I follow him on Twixter, and I've come to his defense before, even though I don't fully agree with him, and I'll open that up a little bit. But he talks about the idea that qualia have no standalone metaphysical status or ontological status. I think there's room for conversation there. I don't fully agree. I might be a fence sitter. I'm kind of into weak illusionism a little bit, but not strong illusionism like Frankish might be. But I also would be skeptical in a very healthy way to help promote the idea that qualia may have some ontological or metaphysical status. But I would be skeptical. I don't know. I could never know, and I could never be the one to come up with something that would demonstrate that it does. So that I just have to take that guarded position. I mean, again, fence sitting, I don't know. But again, I would be somewhat of a weak illusionist in a sense, because there's realism and there's representationalism and there's other ways to talk about how we actually bring in sense data and how we process sense data. Are we really seeing the world for what it is? And so, and people who really know how to argue this would probably throw me out the window on this and say, you're heading off the rails on this. But this is how I lens it. And this is like to say that there's naive realism or direct realism in saying that we one-to-one map what's going on out there in reality. All the colors are what they are, all the shapes are what they are, all the atoms and molecules and everything that we perceive to be in a chair or a table or whatever are there as they are truly established. And I would then go into a middle ground and say, well, maybe that's the case, but I think what our sense organs are giving us is that truly what is going on. So an example might be that I bring up sometimes is information theorists will say that our sense organs bring in 10 million bits of data per second, but we are only on our screen of awareness, we only have 40 to 120 of those bits accessible to us to process reality, to process the picture of that we're experiencing, the lights, the sounds, and all that. Again, providing you have a sense organ. So there's a filtering there, perhaps, or there's a stepping down of what's going on. There's other arguments for entropy and upper limits and upper bounds. What's the term? Active inference, things like that. Entropic states of observation, which a little over my head. But anyway, so I think there's wiggle room there for maybe finding some synthesis between realism and what again is either representationalism or other types of ways of arguing for how we actually take what reality is versus what we experience. And I'm not qualified to really go through that as an argument, but I would grab a little here and grab a little there and say, that there's probably some realistic realism going on, but at the same time, what are we actually experiencing? What are we actually taking in the way of what our senses are delivering to us and how we're processing that? Because here's the other interesting thing. When we have touch, we have smell, sight, every one of those features is being processed differently in our minds. And then we have to have a unity of that experience. So we have, and it's been demonstrated in animals that the unity of experience can be differentiated. And that's getting a little heady and technical, but I would also say that, when we are talking about realism or what we're onboarding as, or what we're constructing as a reality, that we have to trust that there's that unity of my touch, sense, smell, eyes, hearing, all those things that are they're in Congress together to give me an accurate representation of the world. There's a little bit of discussion of that, I think, out there.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack on the topic of quality. Complexity is very intriguing, and that's why this podcast is called the Quality Experience.
You picked a great word. And I was neglectful in saying that my take on qualia, I think, would be to skip ontological and metaphysical arguments, and for the rest of us, those of us who aren't sitting in high towers of academia and intelligentsia, to say that there's another category called epistemics, and there's obviously semantics, words, how we discuss things, and in epistemics as to what we know, what we can know. And I would say for the rest of us out in the world, that on an epistemic level, on a knowledge level, that qualia has a place. That absolutely we need to pay attention to the smell of a rose or the taste of chocolate ice cream, or whatever it is, and the blueness of blue. All those things is that has to be real, even if it's a convenient fiction. It has to be real to us. So that would be my answer to qualia, is that I'm not as much interested as the guys that get real heady about it and say, there's no metaphysics, there's it's not described in physics, it's not really real or whatever. I'd say, okay, that's fine, but the rest of us have to have that language. We have to talk about it, because I want to describe to you, Stan, this beautiful sunset that I saw. The colors were just absolutely amazing, or anything like that. Because how else do we have that value of experience that we can? You can tell me about that beautiful woman that walked down the street. We can both be like, "Wow, that's really gorgeous. That's really neat." You know what I mean? If we don't have that, what do we got? We're going to talk about a bunch of equations and the vector point of the carbon atoms.
Really interact or communicate with others. Let's go to meta-ethics, the nature of ethical concepts and moral judgment. What is your take on that?
Wow, that's huge. So metaethics would be exploring the different camps or species of ethics. And I would say, again, we could lay out a real coarse grain. I'm not good with it, but I'll share what I tend to play around with in my head. I'll go to two philosophers, or there was a school of philosophers, and they were kicking these ideas around. But one of them that's probably better known than others is Immanuel Kant, and he wrote about ethics, and as did Spinoza, and they all took a swing at the bat on this. But I'll pick on Kant for a reason. He had sort of a prescriptive and what they would call deontological treatise of ethics, and his ethics again were sort of a stepping down from Abrahamic ethics and morals. So it was oughts and shalls are kind of the deontological. It's shoulds and should nots, more or less. And it's more based on a concept of law. Like you should and should not do these things because they are bad, because we can demonstrate that, walking up and punching somebody in the face or taking $10 from somebody who has their, blind person begging you take money out of their, we can demonstrate that that's wrong and you should not do it. You should not, because there's a normative there. We have, social contracts, and, so that's one way of framing ethics. And I think handled gingerly, that's fine. But people can get heavy-handed with that, and they can start projecting their own whatever their issues are onto it. Their power issues or piety and all these other things. And so there's a little bit of a danger there. And that's where morality comes in. Morality is, some people argue that morality is nothing but semantics. It's nothing but exchanges of ideas back and forth that have strong demonstrable, arguments that say, oh, well, we need to have morals or we'll be a lawless society, or we'll all, be out raping sheep or whatever it is that we shouldn't be doing. And so, I mean, everything has a value, but I'd say the other option that I'm aware of in ethics, and there are probably other options, is what would be more an ethics of compassion. Now, an ethics of empathy. So it is to understand that if I do something that's not good, it's going to have a negative impact on somebody, and I should feel that. I should not be a sociopath. I should not be a strong, malignant narcissist and take pleasure in somebody else's suffering. That's, again, it falls into the normative category where people will judge you for it. But I think it's also that you get a chance to check in with yourself first before you have to feel beholden to the laws or the standards of the community. So it's a more of a personal ethics. So Schopenhauer spoke to that, Arthur Schopenhauer, who was a curmudgeon-y old German guy, and he wasn't very well liked, but he was an interesting thinker. And Schopenhauer had more of an ethics of compassion than he did of the prescriptive oughts and shalls and things like that. So there's a lot more there, but those are the two things that I stick with. Is like, okay, I could have an ethics based on community guidelines and standards and normatives, or I could also have an ethics within me that says I should feel bad if I do something to somebody that is not good. It's a negative valence. It produces a negative affect in that person, or it violates them, their sovereignty, their bodily sovereignty, or their emotional sovereignty. And nobody should shame me for it. I should be my own, thing that I have to work on. Because when somebody else shames me, then it goes over back to the deontological. They become the judge, the adjudicator that says you shouldn't have done that and you're wrong. So in other words, it's more of an internal or a personal kind of ethics.
Yeah, that was actually our next topic, the normative ethics, and you already stepped into that. The question that would go with that would be, how do we know what's morally right or wrong? How do we decide? Do you think it's a divine, or do you think it's a social construct? Do you think society decides? Where do we get our morals from?
I would definitely, and this is going to, I'm going to be showing some of my cards here. I don't think there's any divine decree or anything, because that goes back into the idea of the deontological ethics, that, something is handed down as an ought and a shall. And that's, of course, Abrahamic tradition. There's a lot of that in there, 10 Commandments, things like that, which, I actually don't have much of a problem with 10 Commandments. It's a good place to start. There's some things there that I'm like, yeah, it's kind of like embellished, but yeah, I would argue that, we cannot rely on, this is, again, where I'm going to show my cards, and it's like, okay, it worked, for about, 2,500 years it worked. But now we're getting into this age of the sterility of empiricism and science-based and evidence-based reality. We've sort of taken the curtain back on the Oz, and I think, and I don't say this cynically, I just say that this is kind of a reality where a lot of people are falling into secular ideas and beliefs. And I think that the fact that there is a punitive father God who will make you burn in hell forever if you do this, that, or the other, I just don't think that's appealing to people anymore. So I will remove that. But with respect to the fact that people use that as a means, then by all means, I'm certainly not going to stand in anybody's way to honor what the Torah says, or what the New Testament says, or what the Quran says. I mean, that's choice. But to move into what I would consider a more modern space in terms of us determining as a culture, as a society, that it is constructed, it is something that we fabricate, but just like in the United States, they came up with this thing called the Constitution, flawed as it may be, but it was an attempt at some sort of egalitarian. Of course, it was slanted for certain folks, but it was an attempt at democracy and an egalitarian. So I think when we get together and we have these little, these discussions to say, well, what is right, what is wrong, that I think it's more our project. It's more what we are responsible for, and that could all change. Pardon?
So you think the social engineering, you think we're involved with it, the societal?
Yeah. I think if we're honest, everything has been constructed historically, and there's a huge, beautiful lineage to it. So we shouldn't say this dismissively. So I'll bring something else, another idea. And so there's moral absolutism and there's moral relativism, which the much despised postmodernists were bringing up. And I think they need each other. I like to like to make that claim, but then I would argue with them and say, well, whose absolutism are we talking about here? And how are we going to fight over who's right? That's where I think that they need a
the
little.
problem comes in when two different people have two different gods.
But even if they're all Pentecostal Christians, even within that denomination, they're all going to have differing, like you just said, they're going to have differing perspectives on what, the little minutia of what a moral judgment or a moral stance is. And that could just digress into, so I think there's just maybe another way to do that. But again, if people want to, undertake that's fine. If that's what it takes to lead a good, healthy life where you're not antisocial, you're not a liability to the culture and society, go for it. But like I said, I think to be successful, let's take Darwinian adaptation here. If morality is if we're on a savanna, an ecosystem of little moralities running around trying to survive, and there's pressure coming from the environment, various environments, and competition for other, moralities preying on each other, or ethics, how does the fittedness come out of that? So I'll just use that sort of cheap analogy or metaphor of adaptation and fittedness and flexibility to have something good emerge, have something fitted to work emerge. And that might be my suggestion. And I brought up relativism and absolutism to say that they can be in a union of opposites, that the relativism is if not taken as an ideology and corrupted and perverted, like some people have done with postmodernist thinking, that it can be used as a tool to modify and help people who want to see a more absolutist view, because you have to refine that absolutist view. Because like I said, otherwise, I think it just evolves into argumentation about who's absolutely right in the absolutist,
Absolutism runs into problems when society evolves and then they have to catch up. And a lot of time it has happened. At first it was, kill all this kind of people. And
Yes.
then when we realized that was wrong, they caught up with it. And that's always a problem with having absolutism. Yeah. I personally would say I've always kind of leaned towards to be innate with it. And then we evolve in society and we channel it the way that benefits us the most. But let me throw this question to you. Would you say a baby has morality, or do you think it's just impacted and then as they grow?
I wouldn't say a newborn baby has the capacity to be moral, because their world, their perceptual world is very narrow. The lens, the aperture is very strongly closed. They are hungry and they have bowel movements and they get distressed for reasons that we wouldn't understand. But it's probably primal. Like, I'm cold. I don't have the attachment to the warm thing that's feeding me. So their needs and wants are very limited at that point. Their world is very small. But I think as we age and get older, I would almost say that children probably have a better moral compass, unless they're dealing with a pathology, that they have a better moral compass than adults, unless they're around adults that are imprinting on them, bad behavior, which
happens all the time. Yeah.
Which happens all the time. But I think if children are in that nice fat part of the bell curve of healthy parenting, where there are boundaries and structure and all these other, whatever child development looks like in a good way, that they would be more inclined, because they don't have a lot of baggage on board. They don't have 20 years of disappointment and anger and bitterness or jealousy or fits of narcissism or whatever. They're just being kids and they're really spontaneous and there's not a lot of psychic baggage on there. So I don't know. I'd say that a baby certainly is not capable of the complexity of what it takes to be a moral person. I think that has to be developed. Moral to me is a tough word to say, but like an ethical person, I probably feel better that way.
Yeah. What about animals? What would you say? Would you say a dog has any form, even if it's rudimentary? I
think dogs have a sense of loyalty to their social, their clique, their social group. I think that there is loyalty there, and this again, I would say is more evolutionary, that it's beneficial to every member of, let's say, a pack of dogs. That's the word I was struggling for. The pack of dogs, it is every dog has their role, just like us as tribal people. A tribe has an order to it, and there are people with various functions in the tribe. There are people who do various tasks and things, and it all works relatively well. So the same thing with any kind of social group like that, I'd say. So pack animals probably have, it's not a morality or an ethics, it's just this, whatever it is, this social glue, this instinct, however you want to call it, whatever's going on, that evolutionary timeline of them being social animals, that they are, it's inherent within them to preserve that order within the pack, because then the pack stays alive. They don't get taken over or killed or whatever. So if that makes sense, it's that there are strong forces both in nature and within the group, and some of it is social. I think some of it's communicated pheromonally, behaviorally. Teeth growling, gnashing, aggression, submission, things like that. There's communication within there, but no, I don't think it's our kind of ethics or morality.
I would say that too.
Yeah.
Because I know in some animals, research has found we detect some form of fairness, and fairness might fall into morality. I think it's just the rudimentary form of it. I don't think they have the capacity to be able to handle the complexity of making moral decisions like we do as humans. Because we're not even perfect at it yet.
No, it's an idea for us, and it shows up. But yeah, we're not fluid. We're not fluent in that behavior. There are creatures. I think they're called eusocial creatures, and they actually, like moles. There's a few species I can't remember, but they raise each other's young. They do cooperative, collective living like that, and so it's a different kind of social structure. But it's very cooperative in some ways, and that it's not moral or ethical, but it's the cooperative behavior, and it speaks to what you were just saying, that they tend to work with each other to be fitted and to stave off the pressures of the environment or competition or predation or things like that.
All right. So we'll go into political philosophy. Where do rights come from? Do you think we are born with rights?
This might be controversial. It's just my opinion, disclaimer. I'd say that rights are just strong privileges that we grant ourselves, that we do consensually. As a collective, as a society. I don't think we have God-given rights, or it's not, birthright is nonsense. It's absolute rubbish. I think the fact that if a society is healthy and running well, then the space for rights to exist, and we can call them rights, rights should flourish, that they should be, sacred at that point. And so, it's not that God gave them to us, it's that we consider them to be sacred, much like as if a God came and handed them down to us, that we have to have that respect. It's not like the entitlement, it's like, oh, it's my divine right or my God-given right. No, that sounds like a spoiled child. The rights have to be fought for. They have to be protected and guarded, and it takes discipline and respect and all these different things coming together. And that ties back into ethics, So I would say that rights are contingent and they're tentative, and it's incumbent upon us as a culture, as a healthy society, to preserve each other's rights, or establish what rights there are, and then preserve them, and not allow bad actors to come in and cue and scramble all of that and warp how we see rights and things like that.
Yeah, now let's step back and talk about societal evolution, like you did earlier. What are the pros and cons of it? As we go on to, manufacture rights, think of the best ways to serve morality. What are the pros of living it up to the society to make the decisions as a collective?
Construct a social order or a set of boundaries to live within. Yeah, again, that comes with a tremendous amount of responsibility and wisdom. That's the first time that word's come up, is it takes wise people to be the stewards and the shopkeepers of these or gatekeepers, or whatever the right word is for that. Because if we establish ourselves as a society and we want rules to live by, or we want laws or rights or whatever it is, has to be forged out of prudence and wisdom, and with as much concern for the overall good as many folks that can benefit as possible, and also safeguarding that people don't game that system for their own selfish benefit. That we can allow for success, we can allow for achievements and accomplishments, but that we safeguard the fact that that can't be hijacked. And so, in other words, that autocracies can arise or totalitarian regimes can come out of strong rhetoricians coming up and saying, "Oh, I'm the gate. I'm the one that's going to take care of you." That happens a lot. That's authoritarianism. So, to have an egalitarian society, I'd say that it takes wisdom, it takes prudence, it takes people showing up as their best selves, again, being self-aware, checking, psychic injury as best they can so that they don't project that out. And again, seek the authoritarian or seek the, even the groupthink, that can permeate, bad decisions and whatever social ills we might point to. And I don't want to point to anything specifically because I think it's universal.
And that don't go under the cons of it. And you said something about authoritarianism. Why do people gravitate towards that? Why do we do that as humans? Is there a psychological explanation for that?
I've heard a few things. One of them is that when people are in an existential crisis, much like when a 2-year-old falls down and skins its knee, it immediately looks for a parent or a guardian to make eye contact with, and then the crying starts. And so I don't think it's much different when we are in existential crisis in a culture, for whatever it is, our sense of what was is breaking down, or we feel threatened, or we're in a victim consciousness, that we look to a parent to save us. And that's basically what theistic structure is. It's a sky father that's going to either punish you really severely or love you unconditionally in paradise. And, it's the same thing with the authoritarian. In fact, I would argue that some expressions of Western Abrahamic beliefs, this isn't the case across the board, but some people lens it that way, that that father in heaven is the authoritarian that will make those people suffer and give me eternal happy paradise, that kind of thing. And I think it's very similar. And we also live vicariously through the authoritarian. They're usually charismatic, they're usually charming, sometimes they're bright, most of the time they're not, not compared to other people who are competent, but that they have that charisma and that charm, and that's what cult leaders are. They charm us into a group complex, and you fall into the structure there and obey. And I think, again, it's security and it's comfort. It's also relinquishment of agency, that I no longer have to be responsible for myself. I have Father to take care of me now. Father will take care of everything. Father's here for us. Father will protect us.
And there's always an element of fear in the middle of it all. There's always that fear factor about it.
Well, that's the thing about cults, is you don't dare step out of your place in a cult. There's hierarchy, and it's much like God. There is the seraphim and cherubim, and then all the way down all the different levels of angels and things like that. And I'm being kind of silly here, but it's similar to cult structure.
I think it's silly to think that there's an almighty God who has 2 places to send some people in, and then other ones to sit wine for all eternity, and somehow he knew the people that were going to go to hell before he made them, and he still made them. It's just weird.
I think there's and we talked about this when you and I first met. There's so much value and potential in again, I'll pick on Abrahamic systems because I don't want to pick on the East, but the Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, there's so much potential there. But it needs reformation, because as it is, it can. And I always say to people, like, if I get into this conversation, that religion's like a hammer. One person can take a hammer and go build a house with it, and another person can take a hammer and smash somebody's head in with it. And religion to me is the same way. One person can take the teachings of, let's say, Christianity and go do wonderful things, and they just added that layer of saying, I'm doing this for Jesus, but they're out there building homes, or they're feeding people, or they're being good people. And there are other people who say, well, I'm saved, I'm born again, and then they just do really crappy things, not horrific things, but just they're not good practitioners of what they claim to be. I don't think they're in good faith.
They're very good at using the loopholes in religion. They always get away.
It's a performative gesture, or it's a veneer that comes on, and then they still act stinky. I wouldn't say they're acting terribly, but some of them just go off. That's the shame, because tradition doesn't deserve that. It deserves something better.
I think the further down it went, the more people kind of misunderstood the message too.
Yeah.
I don't think this is really how the earlier practitioners wanted it to go. Yeah. I think we'll wrap that up really good. Let's go down to the random question I wanted to ask.
Okay.
I know this was a funny one I asked it the last time. I know you said something about how we migrated from Africa and spread out into the world and all that. So I wanted to expand on that a little bit more. Do all humans originate from Africa? What do you think about it? And how did we get to where we are, all spreading out all around the globe with different colors? Yeah.
If you follow the science, then yeah, we all came out of Africa in various diaspora and or populations in diaspora, and the option is creationist science and the 12 tribes of Israel or something like that. And okay, you want to go with that, that's fine, but it leads to a stronger mythologizing of our stories as different cultures or different periods of diaspora and things like that. And I think that's not probably the best move. So, and I don't get into the biblical accounting of much anyway. So, but yeah, I'd say if you follow, anthropology and paleoanthropology and archaeology and things like that, there were various diaspora. And I can't remember, I don't know what the earliest ones were. I know one of the more significant ones was estimated at around 120,000 years ago, when early modern humans were leaving Africa. I think there were other species of Homo that left at different times too. But I'm not really keen on that. I couldn't really speak too well to that. But there's a guy, Kragenford, on YouTube, and he talks more about Indo-European history, but there's some inclusion of the various timelines of migration of human populations globally. So anyway, yeah.
What about the color difference? How did we just white, the black?
Yeah. Folks like myself who are very pale went north, and there was no need for melanin in those northern climates. We had a lot of clothes on. The summers were very brief. Winters were very long. We bleached out basically, and it's kind of a silly way to say it, but we did not need that higher melanin content to block the heavy UV rays of between the tropics, the Tropic of Cancer, Capricorn. We were way up in the 40s and 50s latitude for tens of thousands of years. Genetics are fluid. There's no stasis in genetics. It can be demonstrated when you take populations of faster moving things genetically, like plants or other small simple organisms, that things can change fairly quickly. So if you think about the time span of, let's just say 90,000 years, or going 40 or 50,000 years, that's enough time, I think, for variation in very subtle expressions, very subtle gene expression to allow for how we appear. I could point to other animals that we've interfered with, and we come up with different varied expressions, phenotypes in animals that we work with, and we're running on the same machinery as them genetically. So in other words, dogs are derived of wolves, and they all came from wolves. But then you got Irish wolfhounds and Chihuahuas, or crested Chinese hairless dogs and Saint Bernards. I mean, they don't look much alike, and it's only maybe not even 1,000 years of breeding. It's not that much breeding, but we selected and we accelerated what nature would have otherwise not bothered to do because the selective pressures weren't there. But we were subject to selective pressures in that. We like I said, pale folks like myself were in cold climates, and we were bundled up, and again, we weren't exposed to the sun that much, so there wasn't much need for it.
I've had Richard Dawkins give a lecture on it. It's about similar to how you just explained it. So we're going to wrap up the night with the last topic. It's really up there with the Qualia thing, quantum physics. Studied a little bit of it, watched a couple of documentaries, read some books on it. What would be your take on quantum physics?
Gosh, yeah, I'm not well schooled or versed in that, but it's fascinating that it is a whole nother set of rules and a whole nother, it's not even rules, it's just behaviors of systems that don't relate very well to where we are at a macro level. So the
laws.
Yeah, they're just very they run kind of counterintuitive to what our modern either Einstein's physics or what used to be Newtonian physics that kind of got revised when people like Einstein came along and gave us relativity and relativistic, more modern particle practical physics. Like not quite that scale. Of behavior, of how the universe behaves or how nature behaves. And so to think of the quantum, I think it's interesting terrain, although it's unfortunate that I think that needs to be left to people who are really qualified to talk about it. Because the one thing I'm concerned about is you have people selling quantum elixir online or quantum back massagers, and I'm going to change my quantum mind and all this. And to me, that's just utter nonsense. So that's the thing. Sorry to get editorial and polemic here, but I really wish. So what I'll do as a salve is there's different competing theories about what's going on with quantum physics. There's Copenhagen interpretation, loop quantum gravity. There's quantum Bayesianism, which I like. Christopher Fuchs, I think, is one of the guys that talks about that. There's some people out there doing good, honest work in quantum, understanding what's going on, and I think that hopefully we'll get more progress on that and see. I don't know if they'll be able to resolve the, there's the so-called theory of everything where they can, figure out what gravity isn't doing at the quantum level, and that can't reconcile relativistic physics. And I don't know enough to say that maybe there'll be a resolution of that, or some polymath will come along and finally give us a bridge between. It's kind of like going back to the hard problem of consciousness that they're always worried about, which to me is a non-issue. But anyway, I'm interested in quantum physics. Like I said, I like quantum Bayesianism, and Christopher Fuchs is an interesting guy in that regard. I'm trying to think of other guys. And there's physicists that I like as Leonard Susskind and Sylvester James Gates. There's a lot Gates rather. Susskind is an interesting guy. He argued with Hawking a lot on Hawking radiation, and he came up with that holographic universe theory, which can be abused too. And some people take that and run with it and get weird, but that's fascinating because it was basically an argument about what is preserved at the brain of a black hole, subsequently at the brain of the universe, the outer edges, that we are both informational in a kind of digital sense and also physical in a sense that we recognize as our 3D selves. And I just think that's interesting. And it was basically information preservation when something is consumed into a black hole, that when something enters into a black hole, it is preserved as information on the brain of the black hole, but at the same time it is also a physical object. But it is they were having trouble resolving and reconciling what happens to a physical object as it gets put through that tremendous amount of. I know I'm straying from quantum physics, but it leads back to some weird things that are going on. When I referenced Sylvester James Gates, he was working on supersymmetry and supersymmetry in the late. I want to say he got his doctoral thesis in the late 70s, but I could be wrong. But he's a neat guy. He's trying to work at that almost a quantum level. But like at the relativistic lowest levels, the lowest ontic status that you can have there, and he's a neat guy. And trying to think if there were other, there's some other people whose names escape me who are working with loop quantum gravity too. But that's one that people can look up as a way to.
What fascinates me about quantum physics is the separation of the particles, and no matter how far they separate them, they both act identical.
Yeah, that's spooky action at a distance.
There's no explanation for that. I just wanted to add one physicist to your list right there. My favorite physicist of all is Lawrence Krauss. I don't know if you
Yeah, I know him. Yeah. I lump him in with the spokespeople of science: Brian Greene, Lawrence Krauss, Neil deGrasse Tyson. There's nothing wrong with them. They're not bad, but they spend way too much time lecturing the common man and not. I'd like to see him engaging in peer-to-peer discussions. That, like I said, Leonard Susskind spent 10 years arguing with Stephen Hawking, And it's not just Leonard. It was another collaborator of his who doesn't get the recognition because I can't even bring up his name, but he had a collaborator, and the three of them went round and round to try to reconcile something. Gates is a very soft-spoken and does not seek attention, but he's doing good science just the same. Who is it? What's the other guy that's kind of in my Sean Carroll? Other than his many worlds, he really loves the many worlds thing. But Sean Carroll's is kind of a neat physicist.
Multiverse?
Yeah, he talks about, well, many worlds. So every action has a counterfactual that actually reifies into another physical universe, theoretically. I think he discounts the fact that
every version of you is in the universe.
Every move we make has it may not, it's the what could have been. So I could have, raised my right hand, but I raised my left hand.
Yes.
But in some other universe, I actually raised my right.
There's a version that raised the right.
It's
very interesting.
It was a way to solve Everett's Everett came up with this idea for decoherence and how to resolve when something collapses. Why did it collapse this way? And it was a way out to say that, it collapsed in a way that allowed for both probabilities to be true, and that there was an alternate universe, that the counterfactual actually split off into that other branch of the universe. And, in theory, on paper, Everett's many worlds is kind of interesting, but I don't think it's practical, and I don't know if it's standing up to time. I don't know, but Carroll is an advocate of that. He talks about it, and it's kind of interesting, but I kind of doubt it.
It's something that'll make a great movie, if you ask me.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, you could do a sci-fi drama with that. In fact, there was a movie called Decoherence that's kind of interesting. It does that. It shows like an interference of a decohering reality, of collapsing of probability into form, but it's overlap, and the overlap, it gets weird. It's almost like a sci-fi, not quite horror, but like strong drama. I think the movie was called Decoherence. It played with that idea. It was kind of interesting. But yeah, it is fascinating. And like you said, the non-locality is interesting too. This, as Einstein called it, the spooky action at a distance, that, you could be a galaxy away with two particles that are reacting concomitantly, with no lapse in time, the communication between it, which I think points out our weakness in terms of us understanding really what the ground floor of reality is, what the ontological primitive is, which is where I get agnostic. I have no clue, and I don't think anybody will, and I don't think we'll ever really crack it, fully. But I think we need to live with that. I think we need to be at peace with the fact that we're not going to solve all the mysteries. We can we can
never tell if we're in a simulation, if it's an illusion, or if it's real. What's real is real. There's just no way you can tell. So we just have to believe that we are what we are. Like you said, you have to accept the fact that you have a self and walk with that.
You have to start somewhere. And I think that, the idea of the mythos is working in concert with pragmatic, practical thinking, that the mythos is the portal of creativity. It's the imaginal. So our ancestors did it. That was the number one thing for the longest time is we had myth and allegory to describe what was going on. And then, science came along, and it's doing a great job helping us to understand reality. But I think we also need to bring mythos in at a certain level, not down at the level where the physical sciences are, but, to understand how we move forward as a species to enrich and improve our lives, to have an egalitarian culture that has the least amount of man-made suffering or contrived suffering as possible. And I'm getting, really big and grandiose here, but it's like, I think bringing the imaginal back in, as you were saying with Harris, and the conceptual to wherever it comes, whatever the provenance is, it doesn't matter. It's that, we have that capacity, that we are that kind of primate that can imagine and use the imagination to create a mythos, to create a narrative that helps us sense make in a healthy, pro-social kind of way.
It was great speaking with you. Too many insights. Really, really appreciate it.
Oh, well, thank you, Stanley. And
it's amazing, yeah. And hopefully we can get you back in the near future. And there's other topics I'd like to get into with you.
Yeah.
Biogenesis, universe from something or nothing. Even fate. It's these are topics that I know will be very interesting, and the audience will love to hear you shed light on. But today was amazing. Thank you so much. I learned a lot. just speaking to you, and I'm sure the listeners would also appreciate the time you spent with us.
Well, Stanley,
So,
thank
do you
you.
think you want to end with?
Yeah, well, firstly, I'll offer my gratitude to you again for opening up the space for us to have this discussion. I'll beg the patience of the audience because I probably got a lot of things not 100% right, but at least you got some basic ideas. Take those and get on the magic of Google and start doing some research, look at some things. If anything I said resonated with you, go, open up some stuff and hear from the real experts. We have people who really know how to unpack all these ideas and talk to them. So again, I just wanted to curry some of the thoughts to this discussion so that they can be broadcast out to other people. And again, I'll beg your patience and charity in my maybe not having handled certain ideas or thoughts 100%. And I say that just because I respect it that much. And if anything came out, I hope it inspired somebody to go look and learn more. That
I'm
would
sure
be
a lot. I'm sure a lot came on, and as usual, being modest is also appreciated. Thank
you
you
have
so
to
much.
be. Yeah, I think it could be a virtue, I guess. But yeah, I just because I have so much respect for the work that it's I'm utterly humbled and insignificant in its presence, and that's to me is being in faith. That's what faith is to me, is just to say it's it's about the ideas, and may they be handled properly and all that.
Thank you so much. All right,
Thank you,
Justin.
Stanley. I
Definitely
appreciate
stay
it.
in touch, and I'll throw out an invite in the coming weeks, and we can tackle the topics. I would really appreciate it if you could make out time for us again.
Absolutely. And again, thank you, Stanley. Thank you for what you're doing. Here's to the success of your show.
Thank you so much. And
Yes,
this
sir.
is the Quality Experience Podcast. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning into today's show, Philosophy of the Mind and Societal Evolution with Justin McSweeney. We hope you found it interesting and thought-provoking. While you're here, please follow, subscribe, rate, and leave us a comment to stay updated on all our latest episodes. Your support means the world to us, and we truly appreciate you taking the time to listen. Bye for now.